Hey all, welcome to the next video. The last one was about bump stops, air shocks and bump stops, and how we use nitrogen as a spring. This one's just about continuing on the nitrogen pressure and reservoir location, reservoir functionality and base valves. Hopefully you learn a little bit from it and answer some of your questions. At some point we'll get into cavitation more, and we'll actually kind of describe that and talk to a few people about what they feel. Story first. This is kind of a funny story. Yes, a lot of my stories involve Dave Cole because we have a thing called Dave's Dumb Idea. Speaking of Dave's Dumb Idea, the spec car is the program that he ran where you could rent and drive a spec car in King of the Hammers. It was fun to work with that program. I left another blue towel in a fuel cell. That's another story for another day, but that would be 2 or 3. Ask Dave about that someday. This one is about testing. We got the spec car, first one put together, did a lot of it in this shop, took it out and started testing. We had Chris Ridgway driving, and I was driving a bit. Chris is a way better driver than I. Chris is, I respect him as far as a driver as much as almost anybody that I ride with. And he just complained about a harshness, and cars were riding good. They look good going through the wash. They look good in bumps, but you get in them and they would just blow through. And on the wrong shape and size event, it would just blow through, crash, and hit, make you a little bit shorter in your spine, and just hurt. And it also, if it's a big one, it would buck a little bit, or a lot if it was big enough. Even the dead cat will bounce if you throw it hard enough. So we valved, and when the valving stopped working, I realized it's cavitation. We're just plunging the IFP in the reservoir. So I started bumping up the nitrogen pressure, both front and rear. And Chris came back and says, I thought you needed to make it softer, but I have to admit it got better. And I like hearing that because it told me we were on the right track. Well, we settled on a really high pressure in the rear. Front, not so bad, like 275, which is high, but not out of the realm of usability and not reducing seal life too much. But the rear was way high, so I called John Marking because I wasn't working for Fox at the time, but I was contracted to do some consulting for them, and I told him, and we went through the math, and we established we needed a good base valve, which they didn't have at the time. So they had this prototype DSC that was on a few cars, and so we put a couple on. I think their original ones still had raw aluminum tubes, honestly. Yeah, they did. The first ones we put on, and he and I talked and did some calculations on the base valve mass of the stack and all that stuff, and we came up with something and put the base valves in and went out, and they did the base valve thing where they made it a bit harsh in the little stuff, but man, it was they were good. They were good for a single shock spec car. They were good. They'd fixed all those problems. So that's my story. It just kind of the evolution of how you discover things and how you use nitrogen pressure to make the oil more stable. So watch this video. Tell me what you think. We really like doing these. We like the comments. We like the feedback. So let me know what you want to see. Okay, remote reservoir shock. This is going to tie into a question I had. Two questions in the same day, one on the comments that you should leave down below, and one while we're out testing. So, remote reservoir shock. Got the eyelet, spherical bearing, body cap, reservoir hose, reservoir. In the reservoir, about right there, is an IFP. This is oil. We're not going to do dots. We're going to do lines for oil. No air, all oil, line, 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 line. This is We'll draw a smooth body, but work the same as the coilover. Bearing, piston, right, piston, we'll just draw that piston, nut on the top there, shims, washer. The washer can't be bigger than the piston because it'll rub on the sides. Tenon post, then the shaft. The shaft comes out. Shock, how good is that, huh? Terrible, it's terrible. But all this is oil, all this is oil. The nitrogen's here, okay? Okay, that's a Schrader. Here's a fun fact from Schrader. Patented in the 1800s. Virtually unchanged since then. It's pretty impressive. Schrader is here, or some sort of fill, all oil. You put the nitrogen in here, and it applies force to the oil, and this would actually, by pressing on the diameter of the shaft again, let's just call it 0.875. We could do the pi r squared on that again, but the radius of 0.875 is 0.375. No, it's I'm not going to do it. The radius of 0.875 squared times pi, which means I screwed up that other one. I'm going to have to do that again. I'll look at that. I don't know if I screwed it up. Anyway, that's the pressure. If there's 200 psi in the reservoir, unless there's a lot of expansion and that pressure drops, there's 200 psi pressing on the shaft, and the 200 psi times the area of the shaft, whatever that turns out to be, is the pressure that is forcing the shock apart. So I drew this a little bit wrong. The piston would actually be down here, but I drew it so you could see the oil. No oil or no air or nitrogen mixed. Nitrogen here. Now, why is the reservoir there? Only one reason. No oil that goes through the piston should be going in here. Doesn't care where the piston goes. The only oil that goes into the res is the amount of oil displaced by the shaft. We might as well do that here, just so we know. We can cut this out if we think it's boring. 0.875 times 0.5, the radius is 0.4375. That's why I don't do the math in my head. Equals 0.4375 squared. Equals 0.1914. Okay, that is of a square inch. That's that squared, and then we times that by pi equals times 3.14 equals 0.6. It's 0.60101, so 0.6 of a square inch. Okay, say this is a 12-inch shaft. I drew it wrong again. We're going to call it a 12-inch shaft, but just picture that being right there. So 12 times 0.6 equals 7.2. That is cubic inches. 7.2 cubic inches. So if we have a 2.5 inch reservoir, we have a 2.5 inch reservoir, so we go same thing, we'll work that out. So 2.25 is the actual ID of a 2.5 inch reservoir. They can be 2.38, but 2.25 is what's normally the ID of a 2.5 inch reservoir. So times 0.5 equals times 1.125 equals times 3.14 equals So a 2.25 inch res, without going through the math and boring you, which I did, but we'll cut out, is 3.974 square inches, or 4, because it's close enough. So I have a 4 square inch reservoir, and we need to displace 7.2. So we go 7.2 divided by 4. We need to move this for 7/8 shaft. 7.2 over 4 equals, and I'm terrible at math, so I'm sorry I'm putting you through this, 1.8 inches. So that's how far this IFB has to move for the whole plunge. And that is the only reason for a remote reservoir or a reservoir any sort, piggyback any sort, to be there. Doesn't matter if the hose comes out here or out the bottom, like a bypass shock or any of that. That matters for a different reason, but for the oil displaced by the shaft to go somewhere is why the reservoir's there. Somebody asked about how much pressure, and how do you know how much pressure? The pressure in the IFP, the air pressure in the reservoir behind the IFP is what makes the oil stable. When I say stable, phenomenon known as shear, basically, or cavitation, where you basically boil the oil. If, as you know, if the pressure is low, it's easier to boil oil. If the pressure is high, it's harder to boil oil. So this way we want the oil all under pressure. If you plunge this shaft up to the shaft shock really fast and you overcome the pressure in the reservoir, this IFP just plunges, just pushes down, and moves quickly, and it moves probably all the way at that point because it's being shoved, and it goes down fast. That means we have a very high pressure above the piston and a very low pressure below the piston, and what you get coming out of the piston is cavitation bubbles or oil vapor. And you've all felt it, you've all experienced it. You think the shock is soft, but it's really cavitating. Put my phone away, I don't know, I'm holding it still. It's really cavitating. So how do you fix it? You can run more pressure in the reservoir. You can run more pressure in the reservoir, and that's not a bad thing temporarily, but there's a happy medium. Eventually you'll run enough pressure that the seals, which is called a flange seal or a U-cup, which basically there's a seal that kind of looks like this in there, and the pressure pushes on here and forces the flanges of the U-cup out and seals against that surface, and in it seals against the shaft. So that U-cup is, if you put too much pressure, you put undue stress on the U-cup and it won't last very long. It just doesn't last very long. If you don't put enough, you get cavitation. There's a happy medium. What's the happy medium? Well, this is just one of those things over years of doing it. Lots of smarter people than me have just discovered and tried all different. Somewhere in the 150 to 200 psi. I prefer 200 because that's what I've been taught by some very, very smart people is the best compromise between oil stability and seal life. Some companies recommend 150. If you talk to them, they probably are okay with 200. Most companies don't recommend much more than 200, although in coil over shock, where we're having cavitation, I've gone as much as 520 to get through the day. Don't recommend that because the seal life will be low, but it keeps the IFP in place longer. And sometimes you just do it for one run. You put shims on, it's not making any difference. You still have the same bottom out event, and then you realize you're cavitating. So rather than do another shim change, you just put a bunch more pressure in the res, and all of a sudden it doesn't cavitate. And then you need what they call a base valve. Don't know if we should get into base valve. We can get into base valve. Let's get into base valve. Why not? Base valve. We're going to come over here. Ready? All right. Okay, base valve. Same condition, reservoir. IFP. Hose comes in here. Probably in some sort of apparatus where the hose can come in here as well. It doesn't matter. There is a piston of some variety and it has a tenon post that comes through like this, and it's got a cavity behind it here for the oil to get through, but that tenon post goes and attaches to something, but you get my drift. And then it's got a nut, and then it's got shims, right? Those shims. So the oil coming in has to push and bend that shim out of the way to get past it to get into the reservoir. And then there'll be another set of ports if you've seen a piston, the same as a rebound type port. And on this side, there's a little spring. You know, let's just draw a spring. And then there's a plate, and that pops off, and then the rebound comes up through, unchecked, and goes back into the shock. Base valve, 70s design, or 70s patent. Olin's, I believe. Pretty sure it's Olin's. And then in that same thing, the reason the hose may come out here and we don't come at the top, because you may have a knob. And that knob is attached to some variety of spring or something that when you turn it to make it tighter, it pulls on these shims and making them harder to open. That's the knob. And then there's a little knob on the top, right? Little knob on the top. And that knob is a needle valve that goes through the center where oil can come in here and go right through and then right back out. That's called low speed. We'll talk about that. Low speed and high speed is a terrible way to describe base valves. Both the low speed affects the high speed and the high speed affects the low speed, and it shouldn't be called that. It should be called preload and bleed, in my opinion. It's Wayne's way, so I get to say my opinion. Because if you open the high speed all the way and close the low speed all the way, not much is happening. If you do the opposite and close the low speed all the way, or close the high speed all the way and open the low speed all the way, not much is happening. But somewhere in the middle, there's a good combination of bleed, that's oil that gets past the piston, and preload. Preload means how hard it is to push those shims open, and there's so many ways to do this. There's preloaded shim stacks, there's a set shim stack and then orifice change. There is spring that presses on a shim stack. Those are the three ones that I can think of right off. There's a few not great ones that we won't get into, but most of modern ones are getting pretty good. And so that's pressure. How much is too much? Enough that makes your seal life low. How much is not enough? Low enough pressure that you cavitate quickly. Can you run lower pressure in the reservoir with a base valve? Yes. And for most UTVs out nowadays, they're running about 100 psi in the reservoir because they have a base valve, and that's been proven on the dyno to work in all the conditions that the dyno runs. And dynos are a great thing, but it's also been proven in all race conditions to not work by all the racers I've ever worked with. And we run 200 with a base valve just because the cavitation events is high. So one more little example here. I'm going to get my eraser. My bad chicken scratch math. We'll get rid of this. We'll get rid of this. Just give us a little room right here. So you can see we're going to do a terrible job of drawing a bypass shock. Oh, no reservoir. Piston, we're going to draw the piston right. We're going to draw the spacer, little spacer like that. We're going to draw the top out washer right there like that. We're going to draw the shaft comes through it. The shaft goes up down there like that. Eyelet. We're going to draw the tenon post like that. We're going to draw some shims, 3 because it's big stack. We're going to draw the piston. We're going to draw shims because it's a little stack. Draw the nut. That's cool. Okay, bypass shock. Oh, it's not bypass, there's no tubes. Well, first we have to take out from right here, above the bearing, below the piston, we have to have a port, and it goes to reservoir. It's off the bottom. What are we going to do? It's not going to work. Of course it works. Works fine. Have all this oil. It's in here. When we plunge the shock quickly up into here in a compression event. Oil goes through the piston, and the oil goes through the piston, can just hang out once it's bit through the piston. It doesn't need to go anywhere else except for the amount of piston displaced by the shaft, and that needs to go into the crooked reservoir. That's because the shock is made to turn. That's why the reservoir is crooked. Oil goes in, right? IFP moves a little bit, comes up to there, all good. And again, we'll have a rebound tube here, and we'll draw, we wish I'd have drawn a bypass tube, but a bypass tube will go, or a compression tube will go here. I drew this poorly, but just so you know, that's how they work. And this rebound tube goes in here, and the bypass tube attaches here. And so when the piston is going up, oil goes in, flows down the bypass tube like that, and then you have a tappet right there and a screw, and you can adjust how far the tappet opens. This is not about bypasses, but that's basically how they work. But that is why the reservoir comes out the bottom on bypass shocks, because of cavitation. I'm not going to get into who did it first. I have 4 friends, and all 4 of those friends, plus another acquaintances I wouldn't consider a friend, but consider a real great guy that I'm acquaintance with, all say they did it first. So I'm just going to say, whoever did it, good job. But we know why you did it, and it worked really well. And there's reservoir. Again, oil stability, 200 PSI. Probably what you need, probably not more in a bypass. One thing that you do know though, if with the reservoir at the bottom, if you have a big heavy spring, like a 2,000 pound spring, pushing this shaft, this piston out like this, you can cavitate on rebound. And that happens more than you think with the tube out the bottom. In this configuration, you don't cavitate on rebound because the oil just flows back in, but you cavitate on compression. Most race cars, the compression event is big. A lot of inertia, smashing into Mother Earth. Rebound, small set of springs. You know, probably less than 500 PSI or 500 pounds per inch combined rate pushing out, not a huge event. But there you go. I hope that taught you something. If you have questions, let me know. So that's it. Nitrogen in the reservoir, base valves. And again, thank you very much. We really appreciate you watching. Do me a favor and hit the subscribe button. It helps the channel out a lot. I know I see it a lot, say it a lot, but we're doing really well. And it helps us get more videos out and get you the content you want. Also comment down below. Let us know what you want to see. Thank you very much, and thanks for watching.